December 20th, 1943, 1440 hours, somewhere over Bremen, Germany. Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown sat in the pilot's seat of a B-17 Flying Fortress that was no longer flying, it was falling with style, trailing smoke from 3 damaged engines while hydraulic fluid and fuel streamed from ruptured lines and froze into crystal patterns across the fuselage. He was 21 years old, on his first combat mission as aircraft commander, and in the last 45 minutes, German fighters and flak had transformed his bomber into something that defied every principle of aerodynamics by remaining airborne. His bombardier was dead. His navigator was unconscious and bleeding from head wounds. His tail gunner had been hit so many times the rear section looked like someone had used it for target practice, and the only reason Charlie Brown was still conscious was because he was too stubborn to pass out while his crew needed him. What he didn't know was that 1,000 feet below him, a German fighter pilot named Franz Stigler was climbing toward the crippled bomber with orders to shoot it down, enough ammunition to finish the job, and a decision to make that would haunt both men for the next 40 years until a chance reunion proved that sometimes the enemy you spare becomes the friend you treasure. The mission had started badly and gotten worse with every mile deeper into Germany. The 379th Bombardment Group had launched that morning to hit industrial targets in Bremen, and Charlie Brown's B-17, a brand-new aircraft the crew had nicknamed Ye Old Pub, was flying in the most exposed position of the formation, where new pilots always flew until they proved themselves. The flak had started over the North Sea, black bursts of 88mm shells that filled the sky with shrapnel, and by the time the formation reached Bremen, 2 bombers had already gone down, trailing fire and parachutes. Brown held position, released his bombs over the target, and began the turn toward England, thinking the worst was over. He was wrong. Catastrophically wrong, because the Luftwaffe fighter wings that had been grounded by weather all morning were now airborne and hunting. The first attack came from the 12 o'clock high position, a Focke-Wulf 190 diving straight at the nose of Ye Old Pub with cannons blazing. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant Al-Sadak, was still at his position in the plexiglass nose when 20mm shells punched through the compartment and killed him instantly. The same burst wounded the navigator, Harry Blackwell, who collapsed across his charts with blood pouring from scalp wounds. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Richard Peckout, tried to reach the nose to help, but the intercom was dead, and he couldn't tell who was alive and who wasn't. Brown felt the aircraft shudder from the impacts, saw the nose compartment fill with smoke, and kept flying because stopping wasn't an option when you're 5 miles above enemy territory with 300 miles of hostile airspace between you and safety. The second attack destroyed the number 2 engine. A Messerschmitt Bf-109 came in from the 3 o'clock position and raked the left wing with cannon fire that shredded the engine cowling and severed oil lines. The propeller windmilled uselessly for 10 seconds before the engine seized and stopped, leaving the bomber with 3 functioning engines and a massive drag coefficient from the dead prop. Brown tried to feather the propeller, found that the controls were damaged, and added asymmetric thrust to his growing list of problems that included dying crew members and German fighters trying to kill us. The formation was pulling away, climbing and accelerating, while Ye Old Pub fell behind like a wounded animal separating from the herd, and every pilot knew what happened to stragglers over Germany. The third attack came from directly behind, a classic tail attack that the rear gunner, Staff Sergeant Hugh Eckenrode, should have stopped, but couldn't because his guns were jammed and he was bleeding from fragment wounds across his back and legs. The attacking fighter, another Focke-Wulf, poured cannon shells into the tail section until the entire rear of the fuselage looked like cheese grater. The rudder controls were damaged, the elevator trim was shot away, and Eckenrode was hit again, this time seriously enough that he passed out at his station. The ball turret gunner, Sergeant Sam Blackford, tried to traverse his turret to cover the tail, but his hydraulics were dead, and he was trapped in a plexiglass sphere, watching his aircraft get murdered while unable to help. By 1430 hours, Ye Olde Pub had fallen 5,000 feet below the formation and was alone over Germany, with 4 engines down to 3, then 3 down to 2 as the number 4 engine started smoking and losing power. Brown's airspeed was dropping, his altitude was bleeding away, and his crew was in such bad shape that he didn't even know who was still alive. The waist gunners, Sergeants Al Sadler and Sergeant Anthony Slinker, were trying to treat the wounded, but neither had medical training beyond basic first aid, and the injuries were beyond what a pressure bandage could fix. The engineer, Sergeant Charles Hohenthaner, was trying to stop fuel leaks with his bare hands, pressing torn metal together while aviation gas soaked through his gloves and froze his fingers. The fighter attacks had stopped, not because the Luftwaffe was being merciful, but because the German pilots had expended their ammunition and were returning to base to rearm. Brown had perhaps 10 minutes before fresh fighters found him, 10 minutes to gain altitude and distance and somehow make it to the relative safety of the North Sea, where British Air Sea Rescue might find them if they ditched. He pushed the throttles forward on the 2 remaining engines, felt the bomber shudder and struggle, and watched his airspeed increase from 135 miles per hour to maybe 140. It wasn't enough, would never be enough, but it was all the airplane had left to give. At Jever Airfield, 30 miles northwest of Bremen, Oberlieutenant Franz Stigler was climbing into his Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6 after receiving orders to intercept a crippled American bomber reported heading west at low altitude. Stigler was 27 years old, a combat veteran with 22 confirmed kills, and he needed one more aerial victory to earn the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest military decoration for valor. The standing orders from Luftwaffe High Command were explicit: destroy enemy bombers by any means necessary, no exceptions, no mercy for crews who had just finished dropping bombs on German cities. Stigler had followed those orders for 2 years of combat, shooting down B-17s and B-24s without hesitation because that was his job and because the bombers were killing German civilians, and he was a fighter pilot and this was war. He spotted Ye Olde Pub at 1438 hours, a silver dot against gray clouds, trailing smoke, and losing altitude in a shallow descent that suggested the pilots were barely maintaining control. Stigler closed to 1,000 feet and began his attack approach from the 4 o'clock position, the classic quarter attack that would bring him into firing range with the bomber's right side. His finger was on the trigger, his sight glass was centered on the fuselage, and he needed perhaps 3 seconds of firing to finish what the other fighters had started. Then he got close enough to see details, and what he saw made him take his finger off the trigger and reconsider everything he thought he knew about following orders. The B-17's tail section was shredded, the fabric covering torn away, and the metal framework exposed like broken ribs. The rear gunner was slumped in his position, clearly wounded or dead. The ball turret was stationary, its guns pointing at empty sky, the gunner inside either unable or unwilling to track Stigler's fighter. The left waist gun hung at an odd angle, damaged beyond use. The right waist gun wasn't even manned. Stigler could see into the bomber's interior through holes torn in the fuselage, could see crew members moving in the waist section, could see the cockpit where the pilots were fighting to keep the aircraft level. He could also see blood, frozen in red streaks across the exterior, where it had sprayed from wounds and been instantly frozen by the negative 60-degree temperature at altitude.
What Stigler was looking at wasn't a military target. It was a flying coffin carrying dying men who posed no threat to anyone. The bomber's defensive guns were destroyed or unmanned. The aircraft itself was barely controllable, and finishing it would be murder rather than combat. Stigler had been a fighter pilot since 1940, had fought in North Africa and Europe, had watched friends die, and had killed enemy airmen without hesitation when they were shooting back. But his commanding officer in Africa, Gustav Rodel, had told him something years ago that stuck. You follow the rules of war for you, not for your enemy. You fight by rules to keep your humanity. Shooting a defenseless aircraft full of wounded men wasn't combat, it was execution, and Franz Stigler decided in that moment that he wouldn't do it, regardless of orders or awards or what high command expected. He pulled alongside Ye Old Pub, close enough that Charlie Brown could see him through the cockpit window. Brown's first reaction was terror, because German fighters that close meant death. But the Messerschmitt wasn't shooting, it was flying formation on the bomber's right wing. Stigler looked across the 20 feet of empty air between the aircraft and made eye contact with Brown, then gestured toward the ground, a clear signal meaning land now or I'll shoot you down. Brown shook his head and pointed west toward the North Sea in England. Stigler understood. These men were trying to get home, and they'd rather die trying than spend the war in a POW camp. Stigler made his decision. He couldn't shoot them, wouldn't shoot them, but he couldn't just leave them either, because other German fighters would find them and finish the job without his moral complications. The solution was insane and violated every regulation in the Luftwaffe tactical manual. He would escort the bomber out of German airspace, flying close enough that German flak batteries wouldn't fire for fear of hitting him, providing protection through his presence rather than his weapons. If his own commanders found out, he'd face a firing squad for aiding the enemy. If the bomber's gunners recovered enough to shoot at him, he'd die from friendly fire. But Stigler had decided that keeping his humanity was worth the risk. The flight from Bremen to the North Sea coast took 22 minutes that felt like hours. Stigler flew formation on the bomber's wing, sometimes dropping below to check for additional damage, sometimes pulling ahead to wave off German flak batteries that were tracking the crippled B-17. Brown didn't understand what was happening, couldn't comprehend why an enemy fighter was protecting him, but he was too focused on keeping the aircraft flying to question his impossible good fortune. The co-pilot, Second Lieutenant Spencer Luke, kept glancing at the Messerschmitt and waiting for it to open fire, but Stigler just flew alongside, like an escort fighter protecting a charge. They crossed the German coastline at 15:02 hours. Stigler pulled close one final time, saluted, and peeled away, back toward German airspace before British coastal defenses could engage him. Brown watched the Messerschmitt disappear into clouds and tried to process what had just happened. A German fighter pilot had saved his crew, had protected them from other Germans, had risked his own life and career to give them a chance to survive. The why of it was incomprehensible, but the result was that Ye Old Pub was still flying and most of his crew was still alive. The bomber made it another 40 miles before Brown realized they couldn't reach England. The two remaining engines were failing, the fuel situation was critical, and his crew needed medical attention immediately. He ditched in the North Sea at 15:34 hours, impacting the freezing water at 95 miles per hour. The fuselage broke apart on impact, but the life rafts deployed, and the surviving crew members made it out before the bomber sank. British Air-Sea Rescue picked them up within 2 hours, hypothermic and injured, but alive. Of the 10 men who'd flown the mission, 1 was dead, 4 were seriously wounded, and all of them owed their survival to a German pilot whose name they didn't know. Charlie Brown filed his mission report and mentioned the German fighter that had escorted them out, but the intelligence officers didn't believe him. German fighters didn't protect American bombers, they destroyed them, and Brown's story sounded like combat stress or a misidentification. The report was filed away and forgotten, another strange incident in a war full of strange incidents. Brown recovered from his injuries, flew more missions, survived the war, and spent the next 4 decades wondering about the German pilot who'd spared him and whether that act of mercy had cost him the man his life. Franz Stigler returned to Yavor Airfield and told no one what he'd done. He couldn't report it without facing court-martial, couldn't claim a kill he hadn't made, couldn't explain why he'd disobeyed direct orders and aided enemy bombers. He flew more missions, survived the war, and emigrated to Canada in 1953, where he became a successful businessman. He also spent decades wondering whether the American bomber had made it home and whether the crew had survived the ditching he'd watched from a distance before turning back. In 1986, Charlie Brown was reading a book about air combat when he decided to try finding the German pilot who'd saved him.
He placed an advertisement in a military aviation newsletter describing the incident and asking if anyone knew the pilot's identity. The ad reached Franz Stigler in Vancouver, who read it and immediately recognized the details, the date, the location, the damaged B-17 with the shredded tail section. He contacted Brown, they arranged a meeting, and when they met in person for the first time since 1943, they embraced like brothers. The friendship that developed was extraordinary because it transcended everything that should have made it impossible. Brown was American, Stigler was German. Brown had bombed German cities. Stigler had shot down American bombers. They'd shared a moment of humanity at 10,000 feet over Bremen when one man decided that following orders mattered less than doing what was right. They spent the next 22 years as close friends, attending air shows together, telling their story to audiences who could barely believe it, and proving that even in war, decency could survive if someone was brave enough to choose it. Franz Stigler died on March 22, 2008, at age 92. Charlie Brown died 8 months later, on November 24th, at age 87. They're buried thousands of miles apart, but their story lives on as proof that humanity can exist even in combat, that mercy can be stronger than orders, and that sometimes the enemy you spare becomes the friend you treasure. The German ace, who needed one more kill to earn his nation's highest honor, chose instead to save 10 American lives, and that decision defined him more than any medal ever could. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're covering the stories where enemies chose mercy over murder and prove that even in war, humanity matters more than victory. Drop a comment telling us whether you think Stigler made the right choice or whether following orders should override personal morality, because that question about when to disobey defines what it means to be human rather than just a myth.